If you enjoy my work, please subscribe and like. Also, check out my Patreon for early access, patron bonuses, and stay sparkly. Foul is Fair, Chapter 36, Quest for the King. Aisling led the girls in costume on a circuitous route. Even with her help, they ended up having to hide several times in order to avoid various patrols. Seelie or unseelie, it didn't matter. Kasha and Justin were out for attention, while the smaller group needed to evade both the Queen's people and the Grey Ladies. Much as the Grey Lady had come and gone quickly with just a word of warning, they'd been sure that it had, indeed, been a warning, and sending the raiding party after the sword definitely hadn't been quiet or patient. The need for stealth slowed them down. The extension to their route slowed progress further. At the very least, both were relieved when they reached the foothills, even if the walk became more difficult. In matters regarding Riacard, they'd been pretty sure the pixie would stay focused and take them the right direction. But with Aisling, it was never a sure thing until a task was complete. The walk turned into a climb, occasionally treacherous, moving up nearly vertical stretches of rock and hoping for the stability of handholds, whether in rocks or of the various climbing vines or small trees growing amidst the rocks. Lonnie had recovered their gear from the previous trip and restocked. This left them with heavier packs, but at least they had rope and climbing tools, making the way a little easier for whoever was taking their turn trailing the other, once they managed each stretch. A couple of times, on seeing caves or dark recesses in the rock, they thought they were nearing the end of their journey, but each time the crow passed it by and kept climbing, occasionally circling back to make sure the girls hadn't been lost. The biggest problem, eventually, turned out not to be the difficulty of the climb or the exhaustion of doing so, but the exposed nature of the mountain faces. Without cover and having to move slowly, it turned out to be inevitable that they'd eventually be seen. They were nearly knocked from the cliff face they were climbing when a burst of fire impacted the stone behind them, a shockwave following the explosion. Lonnie just managed to roll up over the top of the current expanse onto level ground and grabbed for her friend's wrist before the impact shook her free. Though they had covered a lot of ground, it now didn't seem nearly high or far enough, and they picked up on signs of flying dots in the distance coming their way, leaving them pretty certain the pixie arrows were going to be a problem soon. Adrenaline took over, and the pair launched themselves back up the mountainside, moving with less caution than before in their haste to get cover without being trapped. The haste almost caused a couple of falls, as untested handholds gave way, but each time, quick rescues were made, or the second grab found something more solid. "This way!" Aisling finally called, the first thing she'd said in ages, as Red Riding Megan was pulling herself up over another cliff face and onto a longer stretch of mostly level ground dotted with sharp rock outcroppings. When she reached down to help Lonnie, a small dart missed her hand by inches, embedding into the rock. Another two found homes in nearby plants. "Hurry!" she called down. Lonnie was hurrying her best, but was having trouble reaching a couple of the handholds. Nearly being hit with a couple of pixie arrows from the oncoming archers wasn't helping. "Go on!" she shouted. "Get to cover!" This was ignored, and soon rope got Lonnie up the last bit. They were almost to the rocks when Lonnie screamed, tumbling over, clutching at her calf where one of the arrows was embedded. With help, she dragged herself behind the rocks, struggling to stay awake. As soon as they had brief protection from the rocks, she went through her pack with increasingly numb hands. She needed help to get the caffeine boost gum out of the pack, unable to manage the finesse of the wrappers. She didn't at all care for the faux energy drink artificial taste, but the gum helped, if only barely. A glance back over the rocks confirmed the pixies closing in. Gambling, Red Riding Megan wrapped the cloak around her and stood, doing her best to belt out the lyrics to a song. Out of breath and frantic, nothing magical happened, but at this height, the pixies, who may have heard of the experience with winds in the clearing, or even been there, were taking no chances. The butterfly-winged patrols scattered, ducking and diving for something to hold on to. In the brief lull, both girls took off as fast as they could manage after Aisling. "You're sure this thing is going to work?" "If we can make it to the cave," Lonnie called back, having a rough time managing to dig the compass out of her pocket as they scrambled. "It's right up there!" Aisling shouted back at them, darting around the bend. A handful of tiny arrows hit the rocks behind them, another punching a hole through one side of the red cape, entangling in the fabric without hitting flesh. Even with the renewed rush of panicked energy at being shot at, Lonnie barely managed to stay upright, lurching and almost falling before catching herself on an outcropping. "Keep going," she tried again. The other two turned back for her anyway, though she needed some additional support to walk in a straight line, struggling to stay awake as they walked, focusing on Aisling's assurances that the cave was closed now. Two moth-winged shapes streaked by overhead, racing for the cave without any attempt at firing at the girls, just to warn whoever was on guard inside. As they moved, there was another out-of-breath attempt at singing. This time, with level ground to fall onto if things went badly, or having noted the earlier failure, the patrols behind them barely slowed down. The cave entrance came into view, a huge, icy maw in the midst of gray stone. They could see the jagged, reflective surfaces just inside, and numerous possible passages into the cave. Lonnie clutched tightly at her compass, gesturing with the other arm which way they should be headed as they made the cave mouth, while being almost pulled by her friend as much as she was managing to run on her own. Lonnie was dead weight as another arrow jabbed into her shoulder, and the compass hit the ground, rolling and clattering along the stone. Aisling doubled back, landing and shouting encouragement, but couldn't offer much more help while Lonnie was dragged along. They just made the mouth of the cave ahead of more arrows, taking cover, and starting to head in the direction Lonnie had been pointing, when figures emerged from the darkness within the cave. Pixies and sprites landed, or hovered behind them as they stopped, several armed figures emerging from various passages to block their way. The mixture of lightly armored knights and redcaps made for a motley alliance, but at least for the moment they were working in obvious unison. Peadar took the lead of the group, spinning his bat around in one hand, his grin just getting bigger and bigger as he approached the girl in the red cloak. "Well, well, well, what do we have here? I'm impressed you made it this far. Good job. Afraid you're not going to be rescuing Riakar today, though. Unless..." He paused as a thought occurred to him. "Unless you want to call that favor in." Around the cave, hands on weapons tensed as the she, redcaps, pixies, and sprites all glanced at each other nervously, suddenly uncertain of the alliance, and who would turn what way if Peadar mutinied for the sake of seeing his debt cancelled. Aisling took a moment to drag the compass back over, lifting it with a strain and shoving it upwards, determined to see Riakard rescued. Pulling her cloak around her a little tighter, Red Riding Megan made an effort to wake Lonnie up in hopes of getting her advice, while the silence and uncertainty in the cave stretched on. With Lonnie still fast asleep, she finally looked down at Aisling and her compass, then up at the lead redcap, and shook her head. "No, no, not now. We surrender."